Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell. Bill's going to kick us off with talking about irrigation in your gardens.
Welcome back. This is Bill Brush in a Nutshell. Today we're going to have another in our series on gardening. And this one, although not necessarily specific, it's probably the most important thing you're going to do as a gardener. And that's learning how to irrigate. Because in any crop, irrigation is always the key to success. First, where are you? Are you in the country? Are you out in an urban setting where you're in town using town water? There's going to be lots of variables in what things that you'll have to do to be successful. But first, we're going to talk about, okay, when we say irrigation, what is the critical thing that we really want to know? How much is enough? How much is too much? What are the problems with not enough? What are the problems when I have too much? How do I check? Where do I check? So we look at all of these things because the reason irrigation is so important. Plants feed and they take up moisture in the aerobic zone, and the nutrients flow in the soil solution. So if it's wetter around the roots, there can be some movement into the root. But when the root is totally saturated and your ground is totally saturated, nothing moves. No water goes in, no nutrients go in until there is less water in the root to be able to pull nutrients in. So it has to transpire and get rid of moisture. And depending on the weather, that may not be the best. So it's always better not to overwater.
Now Bill's going to briefly touch on the importance of the quality of your water.
The other thing is that when you're looking at that irrigation water, what is the quality of it? And I'm not going to go in deep into the quality, but I know a lot of people that have tried in gardens. And one of the reasons is for health's sake. A lot of chlorination goes into your water in town, because they have a big water source and they try to keep it clean so nobody gets any infection or any sickness from it. So what do? They chlorinate it. Well, plants, they don't like chlorination. And really, it isn't the plants themselves that doesn't like it. It's the microbiology. If you want to kill, bacteria and things like that are essential in the soil to help feed the plant and mineralize nutrients and give them to the plant to uptake, you don't want to be knocking them out. The microbiology is essential in growing a good garden. We try to build up soil humus. We try to build up organic matter and carbon material, and we get this alive soil that really is working hard and mineralizing. But when we put chlorination on them, and that's our source, the first thing we'll start to worry about is that you'll start to kill a lot of this back, and it'll make it sluggish and slow it down. And when it does, then the plant's not near as successful picking up nutrients, and everything's not ever as good as it could have been. So how do we fix that? There's not a lot of things you can do. One of the things you can do is up your organic matter, get you a lot of good compost, and I mean good compost, one that's well managed, put together right, stabilized. It's got a good carbon to nitrogen ratio. In other words, 1 part nitrogen to at least 12 to 15 is ideal parts of carbon. So 1 part nitrogen to 15 parts of carbon. That's what you'd like to shoot for. No more than 20, no less than 12. And keep it in that range from 12 to 20, and it'll be a good one for you. And you can work it in, and what it'll do is it'll help buffer the soil a little bit more. It'll also take up and eat up a little bit of that chloride. The plant does need chloride, but you need to have that number down, but way below what it is coming out in most water supplies. Most of it's treated to at least 1 part per million or higher, depending on what they're trying to get rid of. The other way you can do that is also take a good beneficial salt. And a lot of people don't look at it as a salt, but it truly is a salt. And that's gypsum, calcium sulfate. What calcium sulfate can do for you, it'll basically give you the ability to open up the ground and keep it open, so that you can get chloride to move through the ground rather than attaching on the soil colloid and hanging around and do more damage to your microbiology. If we can get water to flow, that chloride ion will move through the soil and get it out of our hair so that it's not, remember, it's only got to go down about 6 to 8 inches, and it'll be really where it won't really hurt us much, because we want to keep the aerobic zone, that top 4 to 6 inches, really active microbiology wise, so that we get a lot of work going on there. So the other thing that happens too is if you overwater with a highly chlorinated water, it sits there for how long? And it doesn't move at all. That's why overwatering in a garden situation in town with a chlorinated water can be deadly. It can really knock things out in a hurry. And so that's why you want to work hard at making sure you get water to flow. Gypsum will help that. Okay. And you want to use, somewhere multiple applications, it would be better, but you just want to use somewhere around a pound to 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet, and do that about 2 or 3 times a year, and you'll see a big advantage. If you have a wintertime garden, you probably only need one application there because you can get some rainfall, hopefully, and then that rainfall doesn't have any chlorine in it, and it's going to leach out any chlorine that might be latent or left over. So then you come back to the summertime, spring and summer, where you're going to start to rely on that, that town water that you're going to get, and maybe one, and then mid-season maybe hit that with another pound or two of, or if you've got vegetables that are quick growing and you go for another crop in the summer, then right in between those two crops, do it again. Those are really successful in making things work for you.
Now Bill's going to talk about how you can determine when it's time to irrigate again.
Okay, so we're going to check our ground. We've irrigated. When do we want to irrigate again? How do we know it's time? And the easiest way, without a lot of gizmos, is reach down and grab up a handful of soil, squeeze it hard, and make it into a ball. If you open your hand up and that ball falls apart, it's too dry. If you make a ball and you release your hand and the ball stays there and you touch it on the side and they crumble off, then that's what you want. That's about a mixture, half air and half water in all of those pore spaces. And that's where you want to keep it. If you get that ball and you basically at this point be scraping up mud, and you squeeze that and you take your hand off and you see water being squeezed out, obviously that's way too much. And so what we try to do is get this little, what I call it the ball test, is make a ball full of soil in your hand, squeeze it, and see it, does it crumble and fall apart easily? You need probably add a little water. If it makes a ball and stays as a ball and breaks back off and is very pliable, that's where we want to be. You don't need to irrigate. And obviously, most of the time, if you see it's muddy and wet and standing water, we know we got way too much. We should try to find some way to rectify that and try to get that water off as soon as possible. As I said before, most all the nutrients flow in the soil solution. What that means is that they are in the soil, they're in water and air, and they move to the roots. As the roots are pulling up moisture, they are being attracted to that, and they move in the soil solution. There's a few that don't. One of those major ones is phosphate. And so these roots have to grow into that phosphate. So a really good thing to do when you plant a garden is make sure you've got a little bit of that along the edge and get that watered in early so that that root system gets stimulated to root flush and expand that. There's a few other things that you've got. If you've got good compost or if you've got good materials that you can find. There's lots of biologicals that people are selling, and some are good and some are bad, and it's very difficult for me to tell you. But if you can get one that's got some mycorrhizal fungi, that's a really beneficial biological stimulant on those. It'll form a nice protective coating over your roots. The mycorrhizal fungi will live in symbiosis with your roots and allow you to take in nutrients and kind of block a lot of the bad things, substances that may be in there. It's a really beneficial. But it's not any good if it doesn't get the soil alive. It's got to have some live fungi that gets on there and then can begin to reproduce and have in the right conditions so that it can prosper.
Now Bill's going to talk about the different types of irrigation you could use.
The next thing too is what type of irrigation are you going to use? So I've seen some people they take a sprinkler, put a sprinkler over the top and sprinkle it. It's nice because you never get too much. You can shut that sprinkler off when it starts to beat up a little bit, and it goes right back in. Then there's drip irrigation, and that's nice, except you've got to have a nice type of aerated soil that's got good organic matter that'll store water and has good calcium and magnesium in the proper amounts, like 68% calcium, 12% magnesium, for that water to basically infiltrate. When you have water really moves in two directions. It moves down and it moves sideways. When it moves down, it's penetrating. When it moves sideways, it's infiltrating. So it's moving into your beds, or it's moving across your hill, or it's moving into and around the roots that have been built up on maybe the hills or up onto the sides of furrows. We'll talk about those in a minute. The other way is just planting everything flat and flood irrigating it. If you have a super sandy soil and immediately that water all goes into the ground, and you monitor it well, you can do that. It's probably my least favorite because you usually go too much water too fast. You go from dry to wet, and it stays dry. You weren't weren't feeding very much. Now I'm wet. I'm not feeding very much. So I have these periods where I'm not feeding my plants all the time. And that's the key to the best gardens, is they're actually feeding it with water and nutrients to the plant every single day. So a lot of people will go and they'll plant things like squash, or they'll plant melons or something up on a hill and put the seeds up there and then water and let that water infiltrate so that all gets wet to the middle. And then they'll keep it wet in that, the trench that's right around that hill. Or they'll put it in furrows where they'll have a trench down there with furrows or hills on each side of it, solid hill going down there. We call that furrows. And those can be irrigated with drip irrigation, which you can put under the surface of the ground, real low, like an inch or two underneath. And then when you turn it on, you can see that water infiltrate to the top. And then you can find out, making sure it's infiltrating downwards too. And you can keep that water all in that 4 to 8 inch area. A lot of these are helpful when it comes time to fertilize. But when you're irrigating, where do I really have to check? 4 inches. That's one of the most important, because if I'm dry at 4 inches, then I'm dry on the top 3. And that means that's my most fertile ground that feeds the plant the most. It can feed a little lower, but most of it's in that top 4 inches. So I want to keep that moist all the time, not wet, but moist, so that I'm feeding that plant all the time. Where am I fertilizing? Fertilizing right on top, which is what's going in there, really hammering it in them top 4 inches. And that top 4 inches will be your best potential to get maximum nutrition into your crop. Okay. The next is at 8 inches, which is more towards the bottom of the aerobic zone. And I want to make sure that water gets all the way to there. And then finally at 12 inches. If I go down to 12 inches and it's too dry, meaning there's absolutely no water anywhere down at 12 inches, means I've never put enough in to penetrate and move things through. And that becomes really important if I'm trying to drive through chlorides, or if I've got some sodium in the water, or sodium or pure salt, sodium chloride. I need to move that stuff through. So I need to make sure I'm getting down to that 12 inches, which is where no air is. So I don't need to worry about that be impacting my crop near as much. So that's very, very important.
Now Bill's going to talk about the different ways you can fertilize.
Same thing that when we talk about the types of irrigation is how do you want to fertilize? And there's all kinds of ways to do it, no matter what you're using, whether you're using organic based or you're using commercial fertilizer or you're using some of both. When you do it in a flood situation like I talked earlier, not a very good way to do it. It's kind of just scattered on top and you hope it moves down through. The other way you can do it is put your fertilizer into water and mix it up, and in what I call drench. If you've got a hill where you've got squash or you've got a melon, and drench right around the top of that till it runs off the hill. Now you've put your fertilizer right there where it's going to do the most good in that top inch or two, and then as you irrigate now coming up behind that, you'll be able to then activate and maximize the uptake of all of that fertilizer. So you've got that. The other way is just into a drip. You basically have just something that has a little more pressure, and there's lots of tools that you could buy at the orchard supplies and everything and the hardware stores where they will actually have a little thing you can tap into your drip and basically constantly feed through that drip the whole time you're irrigating, And then there's always the old kind of old style fertilization, which is, and a lot of them, they're coming out with more and more products. I call them dry products. And you can sprinkle it over the top of like these beds, or you can sprinkle it over the hills that you have, and then let your irrigation dissolve it over time. Okay. It won't immediately, if you just put a flood irrigation, put that, flood over the top, it may move it, or it may just dissolve it and push it out of the area that's most receptive to it, that top 4 inches. So you don't get near as much efficiency out of it. But when you're putting it on, there's a lot of new products that they coat them. Some are coated with what we call sulfur-coated urea, which is a nitrogen product that is a slow feeding over a period of time. Some are polymers that they built so that the polymer breaks down by microbial activity over time, so it doesn't release all of your nutrients at one time. It gives it a longer feeding. A lot of those good products on the market. You can put liquids on. You can use your standard thing. There'll be a few things that, like I use a lot in tree crops particularly. I use a lot of ammonium sulfate. This is not a good product for gardens and tender plants. It's got a real saltiness to it that will have a detrimental effect on most young plants, tender plants. Works good for lawns to green it up. Part of it's the sulfur in it, part of it's the ammonium. Most of the time, too, ammonium is a reproductive form of nitrogen, and most things we're trying to do in a garden are vegetative, so it doesn't work really well in that regard. So it's one to stay away from. Hopefully, I've given you some good ideas today about what to do and don't when we're talking about irrigating. I always have said and told my ag customers and friends, the person that wins the irrigation battle, in other words, irrigates the most successfully, will win the production battle. It is truly the key to success because it's the key to keeping our plants healthy, our microbial activity and our microbial life that we work so hard to build in the soil. And hopefully, if we learn how to irrigate properly, it becomes an art to understand for my garden, for this area is different from that area. For all of these different areas, you learn to be a master gardener because you can irrigate those differently and get monster success out of all of those areas. So hopefully this is beneficial to you. We'll continue to keep adding on to our garden series, and until next time, keep gardening.
Thank you for another fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure everyone very much so enjoyed what you had to say about the importance of irrigation in gardening, as well as fertilization. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.